Okay, welcome back to What's That Bass Wednesday? This is Thursday, February 20th, 2025, and this is the answer to the What's That Bass Wednesday challenge we posed yesterday on the 19th. So here we have these two fish, both collected from streams in Alabama. And what are they? Well, I think we can probably agree that these are fish that we would consider to be spotted bass. Spotted bass, of course, are not actually just a single species. They were two subspecies once upon a time. The top fish here is considered to be an Alabama spotted bass. About 20 years ago, it was elevated to its own species, Alabama bass, Micropterus henscheli. So the bottom fish here is what used to be called a northern spotted bass, sometimes known as a Kentucky spotted bass. When the species descriptions were redone, it just retained spotted bass, and it also retained the original species name, Micropterus punctulatus. So that's what these two fish are. As far as we know, there's no hybridization here. These are pure. And so next question is what are these fish and how do they relate to each other? So here is a range map done by the U.S. Geological Survey of both species. Here in the orange, we have spotted bass. Spotted bass are native to the lower Mississippi River Basin, lower and middle Mississippi River Basin, including the Ohio River Basin. And they're also found in Gulf Coast streams and rivers from Mobile Bay westward into Texas. This area up here in the lower Missouri River Basin, they are considering to be introduced. I'm not 100% sure how they came by that because obviously the Missouri River connects to the Mississippi River and has for eons with no barriers. So I'm not sure exactly on what basis they're considering them introduced. But the bottom line is that if you catch any quote unquote spotted bass in the Missouri River Basin, they are most certainly Micropterus punctulatus spotted bass. Alabama bass are native only to the Mobile River Basin. That is most of Alabama, a little bit of Mississippi, northwestern Georgia, and a little tiny bit of Tennessee. But they have been widely introduced outside their native range. We've talked a lot about that, and there are problems with that in this channel. We're not going to talk about that today. This is more about how to identify them. I drew this circle in a very careful manner. Everything outside of that circle is approximately what their native range actually looks like. That little area in Alabama that's inside that circle is actually in the Chattahoochee Basin, and they're not native there. So these species have been separated forever for a very long time and never crossed, which is how they were able to speciate in the first place. Okay, so how do you tell them apart? Well, the species description of Alabama bass gave us certain characters that some of which are very useful. I'm going to give you the four most useful ones right here, not in any particular order. But lateral line scales are something that's commonly used by taxonomists to identify species. Those are the ones that you can literally see if you have the fish in your hand. It looks like a dotted line running down the length of the fish. Those little dots, if you look very, very close, are actually pores in the scales, and they connect to the lateral line. Very easy to identify and not that hard to count, although there can be a lot of them. And so the number of lateral line scales can really help you speciate things, and they certainly do with these fish. If you look at Alabama bass, they're modal. When they were counting a bunch of specimens to create these species descriptions, the modal ones, the most common observation was 75, with a range of 68 to 84. If you look at spotted bass, there's about 10 less with a much lesser range. And notice that there's almost no overlap between those ranges. The only overlap in those ranges is 68, 69, and 70, and 71. And so really what that tells you is that in general, you have about a 75% chance of correctly identifying fish species using this character. That's really pretty good. So scales above the lateral line, nowhere near as diagnostic. Mode of 8, mode of 7. Those ranges don't overlap essentially except for one, but it's so easy to miss one scale. And so I don't particularly like this feature or this one. I wouldn't use it. Scales below lateral line aren't much better, to be honest with you. 13 versus 11 with highly overlapping ranges. I think that both of these will lead you down the wrong path. The lateral line takes longer to count, granted, but is definitely a more definitive character. Scale rows around the tail, however, do work. There, you're looking at rows all the way around the fleshy part of the tail, right before you get to the fin. And if you look at Alabama bass, the modal count there is 29, and the modal count for spotted bass is 25. But again, notice there's very little overlap. In this case, you're only looking at 26, 27, and 28 being overlapped there. So you have about a 75 to 80% chance of correctly identifying fish. I'm going to show you an example of that in a minute. But these are some characters that are in the species description that you can use to identify these species. Another thing that is in the description that can work but often doesn't, especially for Alabama bass, is what the lateral stripe looks like when it moves onto the tail. And in Alabama bass, often it continues to be a series of blotches, sometimes not even connected. And in contrast, spotted bass, they tend to coalesce into a solid dark line. It's not always true. Sometimes that they're more like this fish. If you look at the big picture up there, you can see it's kind of more like a dotted line or a line connected by dots. Sometimes it literally is just a stripe, but in general, that's a way to tell them apart. I find too the colors very different in these fish. When you're like, if you only catch one or you're only catching the other, sometimes you don't notice this, but when you see them next to each other, it's really obvious. You know, spotted bass are much more green than Alabama bass. When I was working in Tennessee, where spotted bass and largemouth bass are native and common in all their reservoirs, you're always looking to see is it a largemouth or not, if you had a question at all. You don't ever have that question with Alabama bass. You know, you can wonder if they're a shoal bass. You can wonder if they're a red-eye bass. Sometimes you can even wonder if they're a spotted or a smallmouth bass, depending on the coloration going on. But you're not ever going to say, oh, is this a largemouth or not? So I find the color is very different on these animals. And also, and I don't have a great picture to show it in this particular presentation, but spotted bass are much fatter at the same size than Alabama bass, especially in like the 10 to 15 inch range. Spotted bass are little footballs, and at that size, Alabama bass are really quite still thin. Alabama bass grow much faster. They grow like largemouth bass. They reach at 20 inches in like about 6 to 7 years. Spotted bass never reach 20 inches. And you know, they reach about 15 to 16. They're usually about age 8 at that point, near the end of their life. So if you catch really big, quote unquote, spotted bass, the chance of it actually being a spotted bass is really, really small. So I mentioned something about counting lateral line scales. You can do this from pictures if the pictures are high resolution enough, and I'm going to demonstrate that right here. To your left, you have an Alabama bass, and here you're counting scale rows. So you're kind of doing it in a zigzag pattern because, of course, they're diamond shaped. But here you get 14. When I do this, I basically double what I have to account for the other side and add 2, one for the top and one for the bottom, to get an approximate count of about 30, which runs right into the range of Alabama bass. And if you do this with the one on the right, which is the spotted bass, you end up getting 12, which again, if you double it and add 2, you end up with 26, which runs right into that range for the spotted bass and is below the range for Alabama bass. So I find this a very useful way to do it. It's sometimes hard to do in the field. It can be done easily with pictures if you take high enough resolution pictures. It has been very useful for me to identify fish. A few years back, I identified the current world record Alabama bass for IGFA based on pictures that the angler had sent them that were very high resolution. I was easily able to count lateral line scales and around the tail scales and come up with a positive identification of Alabama bass. We already knew it was one because it was 11 pounds, but they wanted something scientific they could hang their hat on. So this really does work. So there are these two fish. This is the challenge for this week. I hope you found this informative, and might help you in the future distinguishing one species from the other. They generally don't co-occur, but people are moving around Alabama bass so much that now they do. And when they do co-occur, a lot of times they're hybridizing, which makes it even harder. But if nothing else, you understand a little bit more about how to identify these two species that are closely related and are commonly encountered when you're fishing. So, if you enjoyed this, please drop a comment down in the comment section, or like it, or whatever it is you do. More importantly, tune in next week for another What's That Bass Wednesday. Thank you very much, and have a nice rest of the week.